So, well, I think there is a question for you, Erkki.
Yeah?
Yeah. The question is, so the person, I understand interoperability as a functionality.
Mm-hmm.
Explain the concept of interoperability equals bureaucracy.
It can result in bureaucracy. The idea there is that if you build this function as a central tool, and it becomes more important, for example, in that discussion, it was like said that what is the most important kind of a focus of an organization? Is it on the system, in terms of interoperability and so forth, or is it actually on users, right? On what the users need, and if you think about modern day users, do we actually know what they need? We probably know well what we need, but if you build a governance system that needs to last for the next 5 or 7 years, do we know what the 60-year-olds need? How do they actually function in society? What way they actually understand how the world works? And if we build IT systems or even governance systems without actually thinking about how do we accommodate these future needs, then we might end up with stuff that people don't really understand.
I don't know, you want to add something?
Yeah, I completely agree. The question is if your interoperability becomes more, if it becomes to be more important to be interoperable than to deliver a good service, then interoperability becomes to be a constraint and not an opportunity. And we as administrations tend to value a lot the fact that you checked all the boxes, that okay, your system is secure, it's interoperable, it is accessible, it's blah, 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 blah. And you look at that, and at the end you said, and do we have happy customers or happy users? And then no one answered that, no one else to answer that question. But you make big meetings, and all the guys said, everything's fine, everything's fine, everything's fine. And when you put the system at the end, in the hands of the final users, then you finally realize that it's not what they wanted at all. But your process, your internal process, have been perfectly respected.
Yeah, so perhaps to complete on that, I would say, as I said during my presentation, if we continue doing the same way we have been doing, we will have the same results. So I think this is important, and indeed, changing the way of doing is this collaboration or partnerships. This morning there was the ministry in Mauritius that said they have delivered a lot of services, and I know other examples in other countries where this happened. So the public administration did what they thought was their transformation, making available a lot of online services, but nobody used them. So I think this is important to consider is, okay, innovation, using the technology just for the sake of using the technology, or thinking that our citizens may need or may like this given service probably is not enough anymore. So we have to find ways to work differently, and perhaps you could tell us which challenges you, for example, went through and cope with in the examples you explained, where you put the private market to play a role. Which are the challenges that you found there?
If you remember the second history I told you about opening data of real estate market, the main challenge is convincing people inside of the administration that opening those data is good. Because you look at those people, and it took 13 years to do that, convincing them that those data can be valued for things they don't even imagine, and that it's okay, that's even positive. And making sure that you have all the classic problems, like they said, oh, but the data are not really correct, we're not sure. If we open that, someone could come to me and say, you did something bad. So they want their responsibility to be discharged. And something I don't mention is, I mentioned quickly, at some point, we start giving that data to real estate professionals. Mm-hmm. In fact, we were not giving to them, we were selling to them. Because it was a few years ago, and at that time, we were in a position where, you need to always cut the budgets in public administrations, and some people starting to say, oh, but in fact, this data have some value, so we can get some money on that. So now we have the problem that some people, they earn money about those data. So when you say, I want to put that on open data that's free for everyone, the guy said, no, because I will lose that money, and it won't be compensated by someone else. So we had to make some work to be able to help them go to see the budget to have extra money to compensate the fact that it's opening. And it's really, for me, so that's the internal problems, but for me the real main problem is that, as I said, you have these big meetings where everyone's saying, okay, security is correct, interoperability, blah, blah, blah. And on those meetings, there is no users. There is no one representing the users. And one of the solutions that we are trying to do more and more is having representative of the users in the room, not just consultancy outside when everything is finished and the decision has already been made. Having people in the room saying, I don't see the value for me as a user. It's not perfect, it's difficult to make, but it's probably one way to constantly make the internal of the administration sync to the users, is that they are here.
I don't know, you want to add something?
I think if you think about like having this kind of idea of the vision here in mind, is that what will be the future in this regard is that I think the next step is that now we still think about sort of government providing services and taking users on board, but I think in the future we need to start thinking about users actually not as users but as citizens. The ones who actually use the services but at the same time also hold the government accountable. So it's not only about what do you want to know regarding, the better services, what do you want as a service, but how do you want to actually control us, what we do as a government as well, in case we have more data and so forth, is that actually this kind of accountability. So it's not only about us consuming as citizen services, but we are also being able to actually give the government into account. So, and I think that even makes the challenge even bigger in that sense, that it's a two-way relationship, and then this kind of digital transformation ideas would actually lead to organizational kind of redrafting, and not only what happens within the government, but in the end, what is the role of the government, what is the role of the civil society, and so on, who does what. Because in the end, even if you think about public services, they are just part of a bigger story, right? So it's what people do themselves as well, what companies offer and stuff like that, and this overall system then would actually kind of, you have the changing of the roles and so forth.
Yeah, it completely redefines the role of the state, what we do, what we don't do. And in France we have, I don't know if it's specifics, but we have people expecting a lot from state. And each time we say, okay, that we stop. We don't do that anymore. Then you have people getting in the street saying, we want more state than that. And we have a kind of schizophrenic visions here on this thing. And I agree with you that it's not just users, it's citizens. And we need to be accountable for them. And that's really a change of mind in the internal administration to think that it's not administrations controlling the country, it's the opposite. It's the administration serving the country. For at least for French people, it's really difficult to make this shift.
There is still some way to go.
Yeah.
I have some other questions. It's a question, what should come first, e-services or digital ID?
At least for France, we have the answer. We have services. We still don't have any ID. We tried to put in place twice programs with digital IDs, and those failed. So we're now starting a third one, trying to not repeat the mistakes of the previous times, but we still have services. And we didn't wait to get an ID to be able to start the services. So ID is a way to make services, it's not the other way around.
What is more feasible in the end, right? So if you would say that it's a good principle to have the ID system because it makes it easier to design and deliver services, but for cultural reasons or whatever reasons it's not possible, then you're blocking off actually services that you could offer alternatively, of course.
I have some examples also where the EAD, okay, was delivered by the public administration, but was not really used. But when the bank sector started to using it, it became, very, very much used. So there is also where we can see how perhaps private and public sector can work together to make the digital transformation happen. I have a long question. Where the talent is not readily available in the public sector to build upon open source code, as was the case with France, and you end up relying heavily upon private sector resources, how do you avoid vendor arrangements that lead to expensive dependencies? Further, how could you possibly attract developed talent to build the capacity that is missing, given resource constraints?
Wow, two big questions. Yeah, the dependency with private sector development is huge. At least by us, we have projects that are almost entirely made by the private sector, and in fact, in some cases, we don't even have the correct monitoring of the contractor, which is really bad, and we try to change that to have at least if there is private sector making the project, that at least we can control it really, that we have enough expertise to do that. We should be realistic in the fact that we always will need to have some development from the private sector. The question is on which topics and what for. That's the classic question. Why do we build? Why do we buy? We have a law in France now saying that by default, we need to open source all developments made by the public sector, except for some defense stuff. But, and this applies also to code that was paid by the public sector. Like if we made some contractors do something, then the code, we are proprietor of the code and we open source it. We have that written in the law, and it's a daily fight to make that into application. But still, we are opening more and more code. Here again, you have some people saying, I don't want to open my code. There are some, it's not well written. There will be some security flaws and all the reasons not to open the code. But still, we're opening more and more code. We have more and more accounts on GitHub. We're trying, we're at the point where just following all that account on GitHub starts to become difficult. We cannot do it anymore by hand. So it means it's working. And on the private sector, for me, we have to split the part into two big parts. We have some common use with companies, with other states, on very classical things. I don't know, emails, clouds, all classical IT infrastructures. We are not that specific. Where we are very specific is usually the way we do, for example, justice process or tax system. It's completely different from France, from Germany, from Estonia, for historic and cultural reasons. So when we do something very similar to other company or other country, getting to see the private sector, they already did those kind of projects 10 times. So they bring us some value, they bring us some experience. In the opposite side, when you make some private company develop the judicial system, in fact, they haven't done that anywhere in the world. They are not better than you. Even more, they are far from the judges. Because when you say to a developer to go and to discuss with a judge, and the developer is working in a private company, it's just a big crash in the relation. So my view on that is we should use the private sector, but being able to challenge it on the classic things. And we should concentrate our forces onto things which are really, or the core business of the administration, the core business, the real modifications of public policies, because that's where it's better to be in the administration than outside, and that's where are the keys of the digital transformation.
Yeah, perhaps I wanted to add something, because before you said that we have to change a bit the mindset of saying that the public administration, the government are controlling the country, but give a bit to citizens. And I would put it that way. If everything is open source and public, even the code, this means that any citizen can improve, do backbones, everything is there. So this means that the dependency in the public sector, in the sense of having a strong dependency on a given company or so, is much less, because indeed everything is open and even the knowledge is shared. So I think this also can be used as a good argument not to continue with this dependency.
Just the second part of the question was about how do you get capabilities or capacities if you're a resource? I think it's almost like, to me, it's a kind of a myth if you think about bureaucracy. There's always the story that IT is so expensive, it's very difficult to actually get the competence. But if you think about bureaucracy, then if you are a financial manager, some kind of general manager, lawyer, or something like that, in most countries, you can get paid more in private sector, right? So Ernst & Young or PricewaterhouseCoopers or whatever will always give you double the money or something like that. So if you don't have resources to actually pay the market rate, what you do what the government has always done. Tell a story, create a mission, create some kind of public purpose why people are there, right? So what we have, I think in Estonia, a lot of our work, why we have had such a sort of strong networks between public and private sector is not about that we believe that public-private partnership or something is cool, but there is some kind of common mission or common vision there and stuff like that. And in some cases, there are competition clauses from moving from one company to another. And this is, for example, the same in the US. US has been using a lot since Obama this idea that you have the government corps, come and work on it. So if you don't have money, you need to figure out what is the story that sells for the people to actually find the purpose there. So I don't know, substitute your military service with digital service in government or something like that, because we have this, right? We have for the people who are not able to go to military, they do something else, right? Mm-hmm. So why not, when we have highly skilled people and we have lack of them, why do we put them to the thing they are not maybe the best at, right?
We have a story like that in France. We have something we called General Interest Entrepreneur. It's a program where you take some people from the civil society and you hire them for a short-term contract and you put them directly into the team, the administration teams. So it allows us to get for a year about data scientists that we put in some administrations, AI specialists, just classical developers, and so on. And the subjects are public. We make a selection of the subjects on which they will work. We make sure that those subjects are meaningful, that they have some, that when the guys will come, they will be able to work on something that counts for the country. And once you do that, we have no problem. We pay them more than the classic administration money, but way less than the private sector for the same kind of jobs. Mm-hmm. And we have no problem getting candidates on this. In fact, the limit today to this program is the global amount of money, not the lack of candidates.
Okay. There's another question. How to motivate governments to innovate democracy using potential of ICT? Perhaps I can already start. Yeah, because there are already some examples where this is being done. And we have a tool which is called EU Survey. So this is an open source tool. It's available. Everybody can use it. And I know that some cities have already used this to go and ask citizens on what they want to do. So the cost for the city to go closer to the citizens was zero almost, because there was something already there. So there are already a lot of solutions there, as you already mentioned. And indeed, this was used by some cities to interact in a better way with the citizens. I would say there are other examples where, for example, the fact of having the code make publicly available, like, for example, how some estimates are done on the taxes to be paid for real estate. So I own a house, how much should I pay? The fact that the code of this calculation was published was really a great transparency act. And in fact, this approaches the citizens because they know exactly how taxes are calculated, so they can intervene and, comment on how this can be changed.
Mm-hmm. So we also have tools, like we have a platform where any administrations can start a public consultancy in 10 minutes. So those tools are necessary, but the real problem is the culture of the administration. Some administrations are using that platform, but not that much, in fact. So we can give tools to the administrations, but it's not enough. What we also have is GovTech startups. We have more and more GovTech startups shaking the administration, and it's usually some of the startups you can debate on they're good or not, but at least it shakes a little bit the administration, which is a good thing. But there is this is a huge problem. It's how do we make the culture of the administration change to do that? And it's coming, but it's very, very, very slow. This change of mind. And opening source code is nice, but it's not sufficient. You have people that just cannot read code. And what we're trying to work on is algorithm transparency. And of course, open sourcing is a way to make algorithm transparency, but we try to have a better layer, something that explains the algorithms that every citizen can understand, which is not just reading the code, because we know that too few citizens can do that. But that's very difficult to do. We had some cases, and we saw that finding the good balance between being too close to the code, it does not really help the citizens. But if you're too far, you're at the political level, and then you lose the links between the two. And we need probably here to have a new layer between what's really done by the administrations, either on the code or on physical way, and the politics. And we lack this layer so that people can start to have the elements to challenge the political views, because today they just don't have it, so they cannot challenge because they don't see. And if we give them the code, the path from the code to the policy is too big, so that people don't make the efforts to make all these paths again. We need to explain, and that's pretty much the role of the a new role for the administration in this digital transformation, to make this, to close this gap, and to explain the difference, so that not just users but citizens can challenge the politics.
Mm-hmm. I think also is that oftentimes when we nowadays talk about sort of new IT solutions, how do we increase participation and so on, we tend to always add something more, right? But we never say that this substitutes for something, right? So if it's, you get another app or another task or another platform to monitor, you just get bored and you just don't do it, right? But the challenge is actually to provide if you provide something that actually substitutes for something, and it's actually easier, cheaper, or better. I mean, that's how things diffuse in society. No one wants. Most of the time, we get very quickly tired of things that are just cool and keep using also on our phones things that are just useful. That's why basically much of Apple deletes apps we don't use, right? Because they are not cool anymore, yeah. And we have them what we had there. So I think in many cases, for example, on the level of policy making in Estonia, for example, I think about when we do this kind of citizen participations and stuff like that, we have huge amounts of government strategies now being drafted. And whenever I meet policymakers in different ministries or something else, I always ask that when you do this kind of asking input from experts or stakeholders, why do you make people write words into Excel? Because this is how most government organizations, and I think also in Brussels, how things work. So if you try to collect ideas, you collect them into Excel nowadays still, and then you add something else. I mean, but it's not, you should substitute that with something. So you need to come up with solutions that actually are better than the existing ones used, not that just are cool for now, but they really need to go into the underlying logic of how governments function, how the organizations function. So we had basically, once we had a seminar with Estonian policymakers, for example, regarding even ministerial coordination. And the agreement between the Vice Deputy Director Generals was that let's stop sending each other 200-page documents. Let's stop spending time putting the documents together, and when we have a question, ask the question straight away. So maybe it's the app or whatever thing it is, but it then needs to substitute that process. Otherwise, it doesn't sort of live long. So.
There is a question which I think is quite focused on what I presented, saying what is the importance of the interoperability framework, or should interoperability be first implemented before the e-government services? For me, I will answer very quickly. Interoperability has to be embedded in the process. So the idea is that we do not do interoperability for the sake of doing interoperability, because then it becomes bureaucracy and we just add layers to whatever we are doing. So this is what is important. And I think that in the digital transformation is the same. We should not think about the process and how then we can digitalize that process, but in fact, we immediately think about the digital process itself. So digital is embedded in the way we do things. And the same for interoperability. It has to come embedded. Well, you have to be aware, but it's not an extra layer or an extra work to be done. Now, some of the things, if you start doing since the beginning, looking at these kind of things, it will be much easier to comply than having to comply afterwards. I don't know if you want to add something. That's another question on proprietary softwares versus open source softwares used by government. So which one is preferable regarding total cost of ownership throughout the life cycle of a project? That's a tough question.
That's a tough question. For me, open source versus closed software is not the good question. The real question is, what do you do by yourself and what do you buy? And buying can be closed software or can be even open source software. If you want to, and it's a question of organization. Saying I will take open source software is too frequently seen as a way to make economies. For me, the real question is this piece of code something strategic for me, and then I need to being able to master it, to change it oftenly, quickly, because that's my job, and then I need to use it, and I need to have the internal competencies to modify it. And you can start from an open source base, but anyhow, you need to make able to work that. Or you can also have a proprietary code-based and having internally the competencies to modify it. Or it's the opposite. It's this piece of code is replaceable. There is tons of other alternatives. It's not strategic for me. I can take something else. The question when you start saying, wait, should I do open source or not? It's usually because you have some economic constraint at some point. And you want to have something cheaper because you don't pay the licenses. But it doesn't change that if you need to make some modifications, at some point you will have to pay for them. Either you have the competencies inside it and you pay guys for that, or you need to have external competencies to do that and you will pay for that too. So it does not change really. For me, it's the same question as before. If it's classic things and there are some scale effects, then take a solution outside, open or closed. If it's something which is your business and it's strategic for you, do it internally. And you can do it internally with open source or with private software.
gave a definition of innovation, right?
Yeah.
If you don't have it, then do it yourself.
Yeah.
Perhaps I would add that indeed open source is considered like less cost, but it's not always the case, because you cannot just take the thing and start using it. In many cases, you need a lot of training and support on the operations that may have a much higher cost than going for proprietary software. So the discussion for the decisions have to go beyond this open source versus proprietary. And what has to be, if you go through public procurement, is to make sure that the open source can be part of the tenders. So this is something that now I think everybody is going to that way. So to have it open, whatever is done is open to all the alternatives, and there are all the criteria that have to be followed.
A last point on that is open source is not magic. I know plenty of open source projects which haven't changed for 2 years. There is no developer, there is no commit, it does not, nothing happens. This is crap. And in the opposite, you can have very bright, very nice open source projects with active community. And for example, you can just say, I want to be part of that, and you can contribute either by having people inside of your administration. We have that more and more. We encourage our own developers or internal developers to contribute to a public open source project, even on their work time, because we think it's good and it's a way for the administration to contribute to that. You can do that. You can bring money to the project. You can start discussing with the project about their roadmaps, about their features, and this can be a better relations than having a classical relations with a company where you just do tenders and public procurement procedures.
Maybe, again, taking the vision idea there, I think what you described also is the open source is also this kind of community and mission building, right? So your challenge now is only how do you get the procurement out of the middle, because the procurement element there comes from the bureaucratic era where you trust nobody, right? Now you actually want to build trust through code, right? So how do you get that out of there? What is actually the way you then finance development of these projects? How do you get this mentality out of there? So we have this kind of procurement for innovations and stuff like that. So that, but again, this depends on the willingness or the sort of the legitimacy again of the government to actually say that this is not a procurement. This is a open source research and development activity where we just don't follow procurement rules.
So the last question, should we expect to see transformational applications built on the blockchain in the coming future? Are the material efficiency gains to be realized as a result, or has the technology been overhyped?
For me, blockchain is not a technology. It's a kind of concept, which is overhyped. But beyond that, there are technologies, real protocols, real implementations, real code, real use cases. And for me, the real question on blockchain is, what are the use cases where having a blockchain is useful? And we started to experiment some things in the French administrations with different use cases, and we found interesting use cases. For me, the interesting use cases is the use cases where we change the position of states. We change the role of states. And in some cases, if you look at their history, state has been used as a third party, a trusted third party, because there was no other solutions. So, for example, today, the Banque de France, which is a central bank, is distributing unique SEPA numbers for money transfer. Why Banque de France? Because you need some guide to ensure that those numbers are unique, otherwise you have some problem. And when the SEPA system was put in place, everyone asked themselves, we can do that, which will be neutral, the central bank. But in fact, there is absolutely, unless the fact that you guarantee it's unique, there is absolutely no value. So in that case, Banque de France experimented with the banks in Paris. They experimented a case where this uniqueness comes from a blockchain protocol, one specific blockchain technology. And in that case, it works because states does not have real value on this uniqueness. If it's ensured by the blockchain, then states can just take a look at how the blockchain works, say everything that everything is fine, and close the service. And here, which is interesting, it's changed the work of states, changed this position from being the points that everyone needs to get through. It's just a guy that ensures that the rules are the same for everyone. So this is an interesting case. If you want to look more on blockchain in France, we recently announced our national blockchain strategy on blockchain, and we wrote that in French and in English for once. So if you look at the Ministry of Economy, you can find website. You can find it.
As time is up, I only say yes. Whatever is the proper answer.
Yeah, so I think that I would take it as a very positive, because I think mindset and things are moving. We still have some challenges ahead, which is interesting because then we have something to do in the future. So I would like to thank you all for your questions, quite interesting questions, and thank both speakers for having shared with us your experiences. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And I have a present.